Hey guys, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm coming to you with my week 2 Victober blog. I'm still in the middle of Shirley and I'm still really enjoying it, though I'm on chapter 11, I think. And for me, it's hit the wall that people were talking about. Although I think most people experience the boredom in the first couple of chapters and have really liked it since. But for me, it's just now hitting that about the 150 page mark, which interestingly is the mark where we have finally met Shirley. I would have thought that a title character would have come into the book much earlier than that. So hopefully she's going to spice some things up. But I think really for me, the issue with Shirley is not really an issue, but it's just that I would rather be spending time with Mr. Moore than with Caroline. I really find Mr. Moore a very compelling character, and like I said, this book kind of gives me some North and South vibes. So I think in a way, Mr. Moore reminds me of John Thornton, and I think that's probably paying him a very high compliment. But right now, I'm still really enjoying this. I think this is beautifully written, and I have to say something that's probably pretty controversial, but I think I like this more than Jane Eyre. Yeah, I said it, yep. And I can't believe that I'm saying that because I'm such a gothic kind of girl. I really go for vibes and atmosphere. And there's a lot about Jane Eyre that kind of skews a little bit spooky or a little bit scary, especially in the earlier parts. And actually in the later parts too, there's a lot about Jane Eyre that's just really about atmosphere and vibe. And I think there's some atmosphere in Shirley, but it's not the same. It's not a gothic book by any stretch of the imagination, which is fine. It's not trying to be, but I just have to say on a personal level, I find it strange that I would like this more than Jane Eyre when Jane Eyre is something that just so personally gets on with me. It's just an aesthetic I really like. So I just am really thoroughly enjoying this. I'm really glad this is the group read this year because I have been really enjoying seeing people write out their comments on Goodreads and see where people are bored and where people are really enjoying it. And apparently I am having the opposite experience to most of the people in the Goodreads group. So I'll be interested to see if that continues. Yesterday, to switch things up and just to kind of give myself a break from Shirley and keep myself reading that for the read-along rather than just reading it straight through, I picked up A Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and this was fine. This was okay. This was just very short. I said that in my TBR video that I was really concerned about its length, and as it turns out, I think I was in the right for that because I just think this whole book needed room to breathe. And you might have heard there's kind of an odd complaint about this book that it takes a weird turn in the second half, and it does. It's a very strange book in that regard because the first half feels very strong, even though it feels like it needs more room to breathe and maybe needs some more description and more build with the characters, in my opinion. The first half is really tight and really interesting. The second half does something very strange, and I won't say what that is for spoiler's sake, but if you've read it, let me know your thoughts on that down below. On the whole, this was fine. I rated this 3 stars because this really is just run-of-the-mill to me. And it's because I think, on the whole, I struggle with shorter works. And also because, like I said also in my TBR video, I don't like Sherlock Holmes. And I don't like Sherlock Holmes as a character. And even though I think there are a lot of differences between him in the books and in any of the adaptations, he's actually a much nicer person in this than he's ever come across in any of the adaptations. I still think I pictured him as Robert Downey Jr. or Benedict Cumberbatch, and another very unpopular opinion, I don't like either one of them. I really do not. And so I think I was really tied to the characterization of him that has been in other adaptations, and so that made me kind of dislike him here too, even though he felt like a far more well-rounded character in this than he ever has in any of the adaptations. I think it's really interesting that apparently all of the television and film adaptation versions of him decide to go with a very one-note characterization, or the one thing that you really know about Sherlock is what they emphasize. And I think in the book anyway, and for a book this short, this is saying something. He feels very well-rounded. For me, I just wanted more breathing room regarding the mystery and even their dynamics as characters. I kind of think they fell into the relationship that they have with each other very, very quickly. But I have to say, something I'll congratulate it for is that it's exactly what you think it's going to be, which on the one hand is disappointing for me because, like I said, I don't much care for Sherlock Holmes. But if you like Sherlock Holmes and all of the adaptations and you haven't read the books, do read them, because it's exactly what you think it is. And that's always something that I want to celebrate about a book, is when it really does do what you think it's going to do. And I find this with Charles Dickens as well. I think what you expect Charles Dickens to be, he always is. And so that's a really interesting thing to say about A Study in Scarlet, is that it very much felt like a true Sherlock Holmes story. In many ways, the adaptations apparently do get it right. So I didn't hate A Study in Scarlet. It's just fine. And I do think I will continue on in the series because a lot of people have told me Hounds of the Baskervilles is the best one. And so I at least want to read that. I want to at least give that one the shot to impress me, and maybe it will make me look back on A Study in Scarlet a little bit more fondly. Good morning. It is Wednesday, and I haven't updated you at all because really, there's been literally nothing to say. I mean, that's the sad thing, is just that I don't feel like I'm in a reading slump, but I don't feel like reading, if that makes any sense. But yesterday I decided to pick up a book that's technically not on my TBR, and that's Studies in the History of the Renaissance by Walter Pater. And I am basically reading this because I am trying to push through the last half of the book that I am writing. And so that's set during the Renaissance period. So I've been trying to read a whole lot that is nonfiction about the period, but I don't want to read it all in one go because I don't want to get burnt out on it. The interesting thing is I don't think this is going to be of very much value to me in terms of research anyway. My water is boiling. I've got to go put on my grits. Are you even a Southerner if you don't like grits? But anyways, about Walter Pater's book, I think this is going to be an interesting read, but I don't think it's going to offer me much in terms of historical research. And at this point, I didn't really expect it to. The thing is with my book is that in the past month or so, I've made the choice to kind of switch location because it was originally set up so that the character started in one place, they went to another, and then they wound up back in that first place for the end of the book. And I'm only halfway through it, so none of this has fully happened yet. But I said to myself, you know, that just doesn't make sense to me. That worries me. And so I decided to switch it all to that one location, which is partially depressing to me because I really liked where we were going. So I'm depressed about that. But I do think it was ultimately the best decision for the story. And so when I made that switch, I also moved up the timeline. So it was originally set in maybe the 1460s or the 1470s. And now I know it's in the 1490s, and I'm kind of mad about that. It's just a little bit easier to find information about that time period. It's just so much easier to find really detailed information on how people dress, on the politics, because really during the Borgia papacy, there was quite a bit of note-taking, and a whole lot happened in the 1490s, and so I'm happy with that, but I just never really wanted my book. I didn't want the characters in my book. I didn't want to read it myself or anyone else to read it and think, okay, I'm going to meet a Borgia, or I'm going to meet Botticelli or Michelangelo. And now that seems like that could possibly happen just based on when the time period is. So I've struggled with that. I do think, though, ultimately that's the best decision for the story. And so Walter Pater's book is not technically, a straightforward nonfiction on the Renaissance. He's talking about things that happened in the Renaissance and their effects on the 19th century and Victorian society, and things that he considers to be Renaissance aspects of the time in which he's living, and things that were Renaissance themed that happened technically before the Renaissance happened, which is really interesting. And he's not going for anything that feels very obvious. The first chapter, he started out with some kind of medieval poem in France that he thinks was really embodying the aesthetics of the Renaissance. And so I think that's interesting that he didn't go for somebody obvious like Petrarch or Dante and said, in their writings that they were trying to bring in the Renaissance. His deal is aestheticism. It's just how everything is beautiful. It's art for art's sake. And that's an interesting attitude to take for the Renaissance. Some people believe that, but art was definitely a business in the Renaissance as well. And it was not always art for art's sake. It was art for whoever will pay me. So I really like his attitude. I think I'm going to like it. Apparently, it's a very romantic themed book. He's almost kind of an afterthought to the romantic generation. Apparently, this book discusses that. He apparently also thinks Pico della Mirandola is a big deal, because that's Pico right there. A very unflattering portrait of him, if you ask me. But hopefully I will make some dent into that. If I don't finish that this month, I'm really not going to be stressed about it, because next month is Nonfiction November, and so I can finish it up then. My goal ultimately with my writing is to finish this book I'm working on so that I can technically take a creative break from it for the month of November, which is NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month, with the goal to write 50,000 words in the month of November. I really want to switch gears and kind of work on a new project for the month of November so that I'm not stuck in this mindset. So my goal is ultimately to finish this month so that I can set it aside and give my mind a break from it, so that when it's time to edit it, I'm not so overly familiar with the story. Well, I really have a lot of work to do, because I am at maybe 44,000 words. My ultimate goal for this would be 70,000. I think it's going to be a fairly short draft. So I'm going to have to come back in my second draft in the editing phase and really bulk up some scenes, which is fine, but I just want to know what the story is, and then I can feel pretty good about it. But for right now, I'm gonna eat my grits and get to work. This is an ideal bowl of grits. So it is Thursday. Tomorrow this vlog has to go up, and to be frank with you, not a whole lot of reading has gotten done this week. And I think it's just that I've been in a weird mood. I just literally have not cared much about reading, and I don't think I'm all that inspired by my TBR. So I have some options here for my next read, and one was not on my TBR, but it might be the one that I pick up. So that one's Armadale by Wilkie Collins. I'm debating picking this up just so that I can have something a little bit more pacey for the weekend. And then I also am really pulled towards Romola, but I know that it's just gonna require a lot of me, and it feels like it could be a book that I could be reading for a very long time, that I could be stuck in for a couple of weeks. And right now in a readathon, that just doesn't seem like the best time to pick it up, which is a sad thing. But since I have started into studies in the history of the Renaissance by Walter Pater, I am really pulled towards Romola because I know it's set at a similar point in time. But an update on this. This is a really strange book, and it is not at all what I assumed it was going to be. It is not a straightforward history of the Renaissance at all. I mean, literally at all. It is more, in a way, having a conversation about whether or not we should be creating art for art's sake, and specifically kind of aestheticism, making things really pretty and really beautiful, and apparently for no reason. And it also likes to delve into, how does art make you feel, like you personally? What is your reaction to this piece of work? Rather than what critics or other professionals might have told you the work is about or how you should feel looking at it. And parts of this are really beautifully written, and I've been going through and underlining things, and I am thrilled about that. But it's a very weird book, and I really don't know how I'm going to rate it. This was included on my 5-star TBR predictions the other day. And I don't know. I don't know how I feel about this, because he's gone into several different people. He has this separated into chapters. And so in a way, this feels a bit like a compliment to Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Artists. But it's very different, because he is just kind of picking and choosing who he believes really made an impact during the period. Like I said, I think he starts with some kind of French medieval poetry. And so he starts to argue that, hey, the Renaissance was coming about in the medieval period, which I also agree with. And he doesn't like, people criticizing the medieval period and calling it dark, when clearly there were shades of greatness there. And he also kind of argues that for like the Romantic period, which he pulls a lot from. I really think he does. That, we're always constantly going through a Renaissance, and like the Romantics went through a Renaissance, and rather than kind of the rebirth and rediscovery of classical art, the Romantics had that with medieval literature and art, which I love. I really love that thought. I love that idea. There's a lot to play with here. I just don't know that I necessarily like it, which seems weird. I like what he's saying, but there's also a lot of really overt sexual innuendo here, and talking about, kind of the private lives of the artists and how that influenced their work, which to me is fine, and I'm sure was rather groundbreaking at the time that this was published, because he does talk quite a bit about Michelangelo. But what's interesting is, in Michelangelo's chapter, he doesn't focus at all on the great works of Michelangelo. Like we think the Sistine Chapel or the David or the Pietà is really, the greatest that he ever achieved. But he really wants to discuss his poetry. And so I think that's fascinating. I really want to read Michelangelo's poetry now. And I noticed that Oxford has an edition of Michelangelo's letters in poetry, and I'm thinking about getting it for Nonfiction November and kind of adjusting my whole TBR for Nonfiction November, because that just sounds fascinating what he had to say. And I'm not a big fan of the Mona Lisa. I'm not a big fan of Da Vinci. Sorry. But his chapter on Da Vinci was really eye-opening to me. And like, he talked about why we are intrigued by the Mona Lisa, and I am not. I just don't get it. The Mona Lisa is one of those things, and I think maybe Da Vinci in general is one of those artists that I literally do not understand. And I recognize what he's doing is good. I'm like, oh yeah, that's fine. But it doesn't inspire anything in me. If we're going with the kind of punchline of this book, it doesn't make me feel anything. So is it really successful as an art piece? But he talks about, we're fascinated by the Mona Lisa because we want to know what she's smiling about. And see, to me personally, I don't think she's smiling. I've never seen her smiling. I just think she's like sitting there like, please get this over with. I am so bored. That's the look on her face to me. So see, I don't have an artistic mind, I guess, because I just don't recognize anything in the Mona Lisa. It's just a complete, thing that goes over my head. But he says that's, the intriguing thing to people over the centuries has been, what is she smiling about? What's she looking at? And he's talking about how art has to be not only important in its own day, but it needs to be prescient, it needs to reach into the future, and it also somehow needs to reach into the past. And so I just was blown away by that. Let me see if I can find the quote. It is therefore as the acolyte of a cult that is at once sacred and profane, spiritual and almost animal, that Pater mediates the troubling beauty of the portrait of Mona Lisa. Her face is etched with all the thoughts and experience of the world, the animalism of Greece, the lust of Rome, the reverie of the Middle Ages with its spiritual ambition and imaginative loves, the return of the pagan world, the sins of the Borgias. And so she sums up the idea of the Renaissance like a sacred emblem. She is older than the rocks among which she sits, Pater declares. Like the vampire, she has been dead many times and learned the secrets of the grave, and has been a diver in deep seas. He also says this, which is really beautiful. All great art was a kind of haunting, a spiritual and sensory presence that had been caught in the image, but which was nonetheless a thing in time and subject to the flow of past, present, and future. It's a rare thing when the introduction nails nearly all of the quotes that you're going to highlight throughout the rest of the book. But I wanted to read this partially because the book that I am writing is set during this time period, and so I wanted to read this for research, but this is not really a straightforward history book. And since it's not, I thought, well, I'm really not going to get anything out of it. It's not going to help me in any way in regards to my book, but that kind of weird relationship between art, the past and the present, and the past kind of reaching forward and touching you on the shoulder and things like that, that's very much the theme of my book. That is very much the theme of my book, maybe in a very literal sense. But that was really revolutionary for me to read because it felt like, okay, at least somebody's going to understand it. Of course, he's been dead for 150 years, but somebody at least would understand it because I'm at that point in my draft where I'm over halfway through. And so I'm at 45,000 words. I'm feeling good, but at the same time, I've now reached the point with it where I don't know if anybody will like it but me. And in a way, that's fine because I'm writing it for me right now. I'm really not writing it for anybody else. But of course, the goal is to eventually share it with people, bring in beta readers. And I want to make sure that when my work is ready for that, that people understand where I'm coming from and why that's the theme I went with. And so it's helpful to me, I guess, to see that somebody else has already considered that theme with Walter Pater here. Really, that's made me feel a whole lot more at ease about what I'm doing. But kind of speaking of history stuff, I think I showed you a clip. Yesterday, I attended a talk at the Bristol Museums with Dr. Kat Jarman, who is the archaeologist who has worked on the Repton site in England. And Repton is where the Great Heathen Army wintered for a couple of years. And so the Great Heathen Army, Ira the Boneless, Uba, the so-called Sons of Ragnar, led that army. But it was a real historical army. Some of the sons you can argue were there, some of them you can't. And of course, she didn't delve into that. It was a really interesting talk in that regard because apparently as an archaeologist, she really can't say what she thinks. She has to really be direct with things that she can back up with scientific evidence. And whereas where I come from as a historian, you can say whatever you think and just try to eventually find something that backs you up, because everything she said, I was like, well, who is that? I know who that is. That's got to be one of these leaders. It's got to be one of these lords. And people ask, like, who is this? Whose grave did you find? She's like, oh, I don't know. I can't say. And I'm like, but it's clear to me it's one of maybe 5 people, but she can't say that. So it's just interesting to see how different our approaches are, even though you would think we were technically in the same field. And I almost went into archaeology. Sometimes I've regretted it, but at times like that, that would bother me because I like being a historian, being able to just say, you know what, I think this happened. Do I know for sure? No. She can't take things like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle or the sagas at face value. And we don't as historians either, of course, but we're able to say, this is what we have, and if we ignore it, then we have nothing, so it's sometimes better just to go with what you have and say, well, somebody wrote this down. Let's assume it's at least partially correct. We'll see, as an archaeologist, she just can't do that. And so she very much wanted to steer away from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle or from talking about any of the leaders of the Great Army. She doesn't even call it the Great Heathen Army. She calls it the Great Army because she doesn't know whether or not they were really called the Great Heathen Army at the time. Well, see, I call them the Great Heathen Army, and I think most historians do because of certain sources where they were mentioned. So it's just really interesting, the approaches, and makes me kind of glad I didn't become an archaeologist because there's a lot of science involved. She talked a lot about these really kind of interesting scientific discoveries that they've made at Repton at the grave sites. And, you know, they found all these skeletons, and the skeletons, when they were carbon dated to the 6th and 7th centuries, which is long before the Vikings set foot in England. And so they were like, but this is weird. They're buried with coins from the 870s, so we know they can't have been buried until then. But the interesting thing is carbon really exists for a very long time, and it specifically exists for a very long time in the ocean. And so if you are somebody who eats a lot of fish, you live off of the ocean. You know, when you carbon date your bones, you very well may be on record as having lived 200 years prior, because carbon is recycled so much in the ocean. Fish eat other fish. When fish die, their carbon goes back into the water and gets into other fish, and so the carbon in the ocean is much older than that on the land. I just want to be here. You know, it hurts to see somebody else living your dream, being at the Repton site. Like, I would just cry. I would just cry every day I was there. I'd be crying over those bones. I'd be crying over the lords they found. They found some dude with a sword literally the length of half of his body, from his torso down to his legs, and he was wearing a Thor's hammer amulet, but he was buried in a Christian grave. And that's what is so fascinating to me about this time period, is the overlap of religion. I think it is so absolutely fascinating. It's really interesting to me, the religion aspect of it, because for a lot of Vikings coming over and hearing about the Christian God, they said, okay, you know, I can accept that. I already worship, 15 gods. And I don't deny that there's another one out there and that he's got power. But from the Christian perspective, it's like, but you can only worship one God. One God, it should be the Christian God. And so it's always an interesting thing in that you'll see in a lot of these Viking graves, they'll be buried in a Christian burial with the feet headed east towards Jerusalem. I mean, these people were buried in a churchyard, which is really interesting. But they'll have those Thor's hammer amulets, or they'll have, some other grave goods with them that make it more of a pagan burial. And so it almost seems like, well, were they hedging their bets? Did they assume, one or the other would take them? Or did they truly believe? But they believed not only in the Christian God, but they believed in their old gods as well, the Norse gods as well. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. That's what, if I went back to school, that's exactly what I would do my research on. I think that is absolutely incredible. But anyways, you didn't come here today to hear me rant about the Vikings. But Victober for me has kind of stalled this week, and I don't really know why. So I'm hoping to try one of these two next as I finish out studies in the history of the Renaissance. And maybe I'll dive into Tess, but I'm way behind on Shirley, and I know that. And it's interesting that I thought when we finally met Shirley, some action would start, but I still find myself really pulled towards Mr. Moore, Robert Moore. I'm really more interested in his storyline than I am in the girls, which is an interesting thing to say, because I think that's been the opposite experience for a lot of people in the Goodreads group. They wanted to get away from him and read more about the women. But this is just an absolutely beautifully written book. And please tell me down below, I had a conversation about this last week, it seems like, but Shirley to me feels like it's almost been written by an entirely different person than the woman who wrote Jane Eyre. It's an entirely different style, and it's stunning, and I love it. And in many ways, I kind of think Shirley is better than Jane Eyre. I'm excited about carrying on with the read-along. I hope I don't continue to fall behind, and then it becomes probably like an accidental DNF, because that's happened to me before with read-alongs, but I just want to prove to myself that I can do something in that format, but apparently I really can't. Next week, I have some time off, so I'm hoping to go on kind of a Victorian walk through our local Victorian cemetery, and I will take y'all along, and I'm certainly going to be cooking some Danish food. So come back for that. Hopefully, it will be a whole lot more interesting than this week's vlog was, but I would love to know how your Victober is going, what you finished this week, what you're currently reading, but that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.